Photoshop something.
And how to sort of think about how you engage with the public, with your group or individually, and how to potentially provoke new ideas as you go about that into the sort of next rendition of events this season. I mentioned this to some of you, but my personal background is I grew up in the Boston area, got interested in the Revolutionary period because of the sort of birth of the war in that region. I started out as a volunteer at Manhattan National Park, but then the biggest thing that I did in 2015 was to be on a French tall ship for 7 months crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That's where I met some of your members. As a volunteer, yeah. But so then I worked as a guide in New Hampshire, leading outdoor trips for kids primarily, using 1750s kit, which was a rush. And then as I was finishing a history degree, I was working with the Scottish Fisheries Museum, which was a bit niche, but that explains my sort of merchant sailor portrayal for you guys today, circa 1780. I worked for 6 seasons as a Fort Ticonderoga tradesperson and also as a museum educator, so a lot of my lessons are drawn from that specifically and the sort of confines of the clothing workshop that I was doing stuff in. So I hope it's not too niche for all of you guys. I would like this to be semi-interactive, so if I say something that is too sassy or provocative, but post back, that's fine. If you have any questions, that's fine as well, but if you want to have a debate, we should probably save that for the end. There's no one way to interp at all. It's got to be contextual, it's got to be specific to you, it's got to be specific to your group and what you're trying to get across. So this is really my approach as I've seen it. Any of you guys been to a cocktail party? Yeah. Have you ever been to a cocktail party where suddenly some of the participants showed up in really outdated fashion? Like 250 years old fashion, and it was kind of weird, and you didn't quite know what that was all about. And there was also no booze at this cocktail party. So there's no sort of social lubricant going on there. And when you saw these people in 250-year-old fashions, you had no idea if they were going to be sort of role-playing, because you saw that at some other cocktail party. But you know, the rules of engagement, unless you're at a museum, are not always set down in stone. So it's inherently challenging for someone dressed like this to just break the ice. And hopefully this sort of idea can get forward if you just think about what you're doing. Freeman Tilden writes a really influential book in 1957 that the National Park Service really uses as their Bible, whether you're at a natural reserve or a historic site. The biggest quote I can draw from that, I'm willing to share any of that with you, is it's a process interpretation where you're forging connections between your audience, the resource, and you. And you're trying to hook them. If you're doing this at a museum, you're typically doing that for money, so that you draw in your audience and they want to come back. The best quote is that interpretation is not instructional. It's not telling people facts or reciting information per se. It's about provocation. It's about hooking them, giving them one little gem of an idea that will move forward. I would argue that what we do is not about saving history, because most of the history that we're depicting is pretty well remembered, at least in popular memory, even if it's misremembered, and we can get into that later. It's not really about sort of forgetting the lessons of the past, in my opinion. And I can, we can debate that later on. For me, it's about engagement, teaching people in a new way that they may have not encountered in a conventional classroom setting, diversifying the story, certainly as far as who's depicted and how, and also potentially making money if you work for a commercial site. But the biggest thing, and we were talking about this earlier, is about empathy. It's about asking sort of why instead of why. Instead of thinking about period clothing as something backward and benighted, by putting it on, you're forcing yourself socially into the context of maybe not defending the past, but certainly taking its angle a little bit more proactively. I'm going to sort of quote Frederick Douglass here. I know it's a little bit anachronistic, but the past is how we make it useful to the present and to the future. To all inspiring motives, to noble deeds which we gain from the past, we are welcome. So now is the time, the present time, sort of dovetailing off of what Will was saying about history being what we make of the past, which we didn't experience and which is irrevocably lost in some way today. In the same way that you guys and your members probably update your material kit every season and you get together for drills, you should ideally get together and talk about, what's the narrative that we're trying to sell. Maybe we've been doing this unintentionally or unconsciously for the last decades, but maybe let's write it down for the first time. In the unit that I often field with for a military portrayal, the 40th Foot, that's existed for decades now, but we haven't yet sort of focused and written down what we're trying to get across in a document that just could be shared and didn't have to be learned painstakingly event after event. So that forethought goes a long way. So for instance, the next season, ideally, when we set up a military recreated camp, we're going to have sentries that are posted on the edges of that camp, almost as sort of Walmart greeters, to bring people in and to make them welcome, but also to provide the first point of contact, to sort of prepare those flyers, to prepare those materials, to get across what that space is going to be structured like before the public ever arrives, so it doesn't happen by accident. Physically, like in this space, it's pretty good, pretty well lit. You guys can hear me. We're not distracted by lots of other. So considering the physical environment you're in, it's pretty basic, but something as sort of obvious as, if I'm speaking to visitors in November and it's really cold, I'm toasty and comfortable in what I'm wearing, but I'd better make a seat by the fire available for them so that they want to engage with me a little bit longer. I would like to ask, and this is the part where I pick on you if you want, what is an example of a site or an event that you went to that had bad sort of feng shui, that arranged your unit in a way that was really unproductive? I've got an example, but I'd like to hear if you guys have any. Yeah. Like where the physical layout of the space hindered you engaging the public. What's that?
I was at about what time they fenced this off like the little caged animals.
Yes.
Walk around, look at us. Look at over here. There's the red war people. Don't get too close, they bite.
Yes. So for instance, I encountered the exact same thing. And we were set in a hayfield that was paddocked. Okay, great. But at the same time, it meant that the public was just far away enough that we couldn't quite shout. There was some banter going on, but no sense of connection. And it turned literally into a history zoo. Like the site could have made money off of peanuts to feed the history people. It was that bad because it looked great visually. It seemed to organize well, but there was no way for visitors to know immediately that they could come in without guides placed there, especially people who are familiar with the workings of the site. And that just really failed in terms of the physical space.
I'll give you another example.
What's up?
A place that you know well.
Yeah.
In an event at Fort Ticonderoga.
Yeah.
And guess what? They put our camp behind the settlers and allowed the settlers to bring their cars in. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay? Someone would have to walk through the modern cars, and nobody did.
Yeah.
That was the most boring BAR event I have ever been at. There was no public.
Yeah.
Okay? And it was, people said, "What was so wrong? It was such a great event."
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. Okay?
Sure. And that can destroy your impression of a great site or a great organization.
Putting us, us and those modern settlers, I
Yeah.
understand they need their cars.
Yep.
But, we needed to be farther away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not speaking for the BAR. I'm an invited guest. I no longer work with Fort Ticonderoga, so I don't want to speak for them as well. But yeah, those simple logistical questions of where you're placed vis-a-vis where people are going to be able to access you or not can make or break your experience, and particularly when you're invited as a volunteer and you're spending your time and money, that can be the crux of whether an event flourishes or not, and whether dozens, if not hundreds of people show up the next year. So yeah, feng shui, not to misuse that label. Yeah.
In Nova Scotia, where I'm from, the towns want us to be part of the sideshow.
Yeah.
So we're literally on the street next to the fairground.
Yeah.
And there's no context, and yeah.
So in the unit that I started doing military stuff with, the age of 16 in the Boston area, we once fought a recreated battle on a soccer pitch. And bold British light infantrymen took cover, as they should, working with their file partners behind blue trash bins. And somehow the effect was, a little bit, they simply could have moved the soccer pitch, goalposts. Little stuff like that just require a little bit more advanced planning on the part of your organizers.
Then the helicopter came in.
Yeah, the helicopter was a choice moment in that one event. Beyond physical space, consider the social space. Like if you're engaging a mom with active young kids or a grandfather who can't hear, then this is all going to block you from being able to have a real connection. At the same time, I'm totally psyched to see friends here today and to huddle and to get into chats about details of what we've done or even just socializing. But reenactor huddling at even the best events is a chronic problem because you're having fun, but if you're purporting to engage the public as part of your core mission or you're promising to cite that, that can be a real impasse. And the onus is on you at that awkward party of public inter with no booze and no sort of game plan usually about how you're going to talk to engage the public. And the worst thing you can potentially say, the least low-hanging fruit, is just, do you have any questions? You need to have thought about that and to have, at the very least, if conversation is really flat, some kind of engagement tool or provocative question that's going to be able to sort of save you, that you have planned in advance. You don't blurt something out, but that can really hook people. And all it takes is just brainstorming with the people that you're already doing events with, I would argue. Who's been on a really bad tour? Yeah. I've given really bad tours too. Have you ever been on a tour where you knew the guide was speaking from a script? Yeah. Where like literally you could have replaced it with a box and you would have had a more coherent experience.
What had happened?
I did not say anything. This is a beautiful building. Yeah, so I think that at the end of the day, your material presentation and what you're wearing and the details of your buttonholes and your material culture build credibility, but they are not the be-all, end-all by any means. So hand-sewn buttonholes don't make public inter better all the time, but Velcro certainly makes it worse. People recognize anachronism because they see it. They know it. It's modern. They've experienced that. People don't always necessarily recognize, for instance, wide trousers or petticoat breeches, but it's a hook, and it clearly seems vivid and specific enough that it has to be there for a reason, and that can, again, lure someone in. I think that when you have those details of immersion or the specific objects of some of the gentlemen who've been walking around with their little watch seals and toys hanging out of their waistband, just like in period portraiture, those little gems, again, are a conversation hook. When you show that you're putting forth inordinate amounts of effort or enthusiasm, that can also be a key way to win over even the most skeptical audience, in the sense that when there's been recreated marches, like Paul helped to organize from, say, Trenton Battlefield to Princeton, you have cars slow down, CU&K, honk, all the energy is positive. Almost nobody is being negative about seeing reenactors walking through a modern landscape, even though that disconnect is funny. And at the same time, you get asked, what are you doing? Oh, we're marching to Princeton. Oh my God, that's incredibly far. And you've won them over by the fact that you're doing that, and clearly you've gone to such trouble in making this kit or doing that thing that they have a reason to sort of give you at least 5 minutes of their time and the benefit of the doubt that you actually might know what you're talking about or care at the very least.
Can I give you a good example?
Yes, please.
Completely, everything was all mishmash. Down in Brooklyn, 2001. We were in Prospect Park, is that the name of the song?
Prospect Park.
And we had this, I think it was supposed to be the Brits and then the Americans, and it got all mishmash. And we marched to the stone house that's about maybe 2-3 blocks down.
Yeah.
It turned into this massive, everybody followed us.
Yeah.
We had kids marching with us. Okay? They were in the revolution.
Yeah.
Okay? We're looking at it, we're saying this is not accurate, that's not accurate, to heck with it. I mean, let me tell you, I don't know how many of those kids remember it.
Yeah.
But I do.
Sure, and I would certainly say that they do as well. And the fact that your shoes were handmade or not didn't matter as much as your ability to marshal that energy in the moment, but material accuracy can help when you're then in that one-on-one conversation following, and people have the confidence that you know what you're doing because you look the part, or you act organically in that role. Something that comes directly from sort of improv theater, the idea of yes and. That you never want to stop dead a conversation and refute a visitor because then you have to start the conversation over again, but you've just been rude to them, so why should they care? Paul Stefani, can you please tell me something that is just grossly misleading or wrong about the American Revolution? And I'm going to try to yes and you. regardless of how I feel.
Well, the British were stupid for standing out there in the line while the Americans hid behind rocks and shot them with their rifles.
That's absolutely true. That's something that's depicted in satire in the period. We see it in a lot of images printed in, Pennsylvania papers, for instance. It's interesting how that gem of idea expands into, a sort of caricature. Isn't that interesting?
What about Paul Revere, though? Didn't he do a whole bunch of crazy things in Boston?
Yeah, it's really fascinating how we compare his first deposition to his later rememberings of the ride and the way that those sometimes add more detail to our awareness of what actually happened on the night of April 18th to 19th. Yeah, it's a really good question.
Mr. Adam.
What's up?
I heard you need 2 teeth to bite me down to be in the army, and a good name.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that a lot of historians are going back and forth about. How what does a life without a lot of processed food, but maybe just as much sugar, do to your dental health, and how many teeth are in your mouth? That's not something I've necessarily seen in sort of period writing, but it's worth considering. Like you're not hammering at bringing the conversation to an ass-grinding halt and then having to start it over by saying, no, you're wrong, this is what I think. It's just not, going to work in many respects. If you can turn that conversation to a way of reframing it as a controversy that was addressed in the period, that is often a great way to do it. So like, if you take the period belief that the Hessians were all drunk on Christmas Eve when they were attacked, and talk about how that was challenged, refuted, and believed at the same time in the 18th century, then you're just like, whoa, look at the people in the past. They had conflicting opinions about this. Or if you say like, yeah, stays, there's a lot of caricature about tight-lacing and the excess of fashion, and look, Lady Gaga wears a meat dress, isn't that cool? If you can reframe it as a debate at the time, then you remove yourself a little bit from the yes, he said, she said, and you are just making it an abstract conversation about what happened. And if you can introduce sort of a modern angle on that, like Lady Gaga, even better, because you can point to it as being more complex. The biggest thing, though, is that interpretation is not content. It's provocation. It's the idea that you can put at least one disturbing idea, in the words of Tilden, that will grow into a fruitful interest. So there's a lot of people, even maybe myself today, that just vomit content onto people because of how much they're excited about the last book that they read. I was really sick of doing mess demonstrations, for instance, by the end of the summer that I last worked in public interp. I was really sick of the low-hanging fruit that I knew people would ask about that were great engagement hooks, but I was sick of having those conversations. So I found myself doing a public mess demo, and I added hot chocolate because I knew that was a military ration. It was justified in the context because I knew that if I got the right visitor, that would lead me to a discussion of the Haitian Revolution. And it worked. It worked because that tactile moment that engaged her kids also hooked in her discussion of abolitionism as a growing movement within the Northeast in the 1770s, and the fact that the ideas of the founding republic here in America then led to the Caribbean, and suddenly we have this new nation arising in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue. And that's what I wanted to get to. I didn't just want to talk at her, I wanted to bring her in because she wanted to engage. If you can be specific about what you're talking about, like really specific, like, oh my god, look at these stamped buttons that are found at 4 different naval wreck sites, even better. If you can, like, Elizabeth, could you please describe an 18th century watch?
An 18th century watch?
Yeah, what does it look like?
Well, it's usually silver on the outside.
Okay.
It has many small little parts.
Yeah,
gears.
but that's so dry. Even the best description of an object, like, oh my god, a watch, hold the watch. Like, to feel an actual object, if you can do that for a visitor that's never experienced what this means to us in wearing it, and what we take for granted is so engaging, that's even better in my opinion.
But what if they drop it?
Yeah, so you have to think about what you want to risk in the hands of the public and how you want to engage with that. I have dropped that watch personally, so I'm not going to be too worried. I think the terms that we use really matter, and academic historians are aware of this because all of their writing is in print, but maybe not so in the field of us hanging out in a farm field and talking to the public. So for instance, put this out there. The 1700s are only 10 years. Blew my mind, right? 1700, 1709, that's it. the long 18th century, typically in academic writing, runs from 1689 to 1815. But the 18th century as a whole is not what I've got on. What I have on is grounded in the 1780s. It's very different from what sailors might have worn in the 1740s. And I think we need to make that distinction even if we're hyper-focused on one very specific topic, because visitors aren't going to know that difference, and you can make a lot of hay out of the words that you use. Lobster versus red coat versus bloody back. All those details really matter, even if it's an entry-level audience. I think if you're talking to kids, you don't dumb it down, but you have to take a fundamentally different approach. I think that kids expect to learn way more comfortably than adults, and they feel a lot more confident about being honest and blunt. Can people give me 3 adjectives for what I look like right now?
Grubby.
Thanks. What else? So you guys are being so shy. A 10-year-old would never be this shy. I've been at school presentations where I got asked why I was a cowboy. I was wearing fisherman sea boots. Let's get into it. That's so cool. I think that you can ask those questions about even the adjectives of the clothing you're wearing and play off that, given the honesty of kids. And if you're worried about somebody dropping stuff, all it takes is working, especially if you're doing stuff at one or several sites, working with them logistically, even legally, for what you're allowed to do. Because I had, for instance, one summer, 3 really disinterested teenage girls, or tweenage girls. They're about 12. And they were not into military history. They thought the fact I was sewing was really weird. And they were just interested in playing with the bundle of ostrich feathers that we had in our workshop. And then they asked, are these flammable? I'm like, I don't know. Let's find out. So I knew I had confidence in the site and the building that I was in, that it was not going to be damaged, and if I worked on the hearth, I could give them flint and steel for a moment, I could then light that char cloth, I could then light that period match, I could light that candle, and they could take that ostrich feather and thrust it into the flame, and they were so hooked throughout that. We were talking then for 40 minutes on the basis of their disinterest in what I had theoretically come to show them, but just followed them through that yes and physically to the thing that actually interested them, and by the end of it, they now understood, okay, yeah, that ostrich feather came from Senegal, it was in the hat of a, artillerist in Canada serving the British Empire. Yeah, and it's flammable. That's so cool. I think that if adults don't necessarily expect to learn because they're on vacation or they're done learning, that's fine. Not everything has to be an academic discussion. But you can hook Pixar questions. Like all the lewd jokes that are in Disney movies, if you're really paying attention when you're an adult, it's like, oh my god, they slipped that in? That's what she said. Then you can ask those type of questions as your hook, even most broadly. And so like a family comes in to my workshop, they seem a little bit hesitant. I'm cajoling them through the door and talking maybe a little about what I'm doing, but then I'm like, hold up, find the most controversial object in the room. Because a kid's going to engage with that at a different level than, say, an adult, and that can get me into a rewarding conversation that results in less repetition and less burnout for me.
What's an example?
Again, like we connected all the objects in the room that were hotly debated in their relation to slavery at the time. Within the imperial exchange that was making a military supply to military tailors working in an established fort. Not to harp on that one example, but that was really effective. I think that if you have specific questions and lined up for kids under 10 who are sort of eager to learn and unabashed and eager to touch things like, superlatives, find the fanciest object, or what are all the animals that are involved. They know what a sheep is, but they don't necessarily understand the difference between bay and broadcloth, and maybe it doesn't matter. But you don't want to ask rhetorical questions to kids 10, 14. That's going to fall flat. If you don't restructure your school program for high schoolers, but you attempt to deliver that to kids who are about to enter college, that will fall flat and not work. So I would challenge teenagers to find the series of antiques that were scattered throughout the room, the building being one of them in the case of the museum. And that would force them from being totally apathetic into actually having to tactily engage and figure out what was replica and what was original, because there were a few. Or asking people to find, which of the objects in this room, similar to the colonial exchange, has traveled the farthest, and obliges people to almost sort of show and tell, bring stuff up. Where did this come from? And not simply you're talking about it, but it's not just sort of this came from the Midlands of England, where it was made in a manufacturing town at a specific workshop that made pins. Right? If you have families or mid-sized groups, then contrast can be really great, because it's nice to see families fight over the right answer. If you have a series of hats that we all have on, well, what's the best? What are the distinctions between an officer and a private's uniform, and which of them would you prefer? Which would you dress like, grandfather versus child? If you have civilians versus regulars versus militia versus auxiliaries, and you pair up those choices even visually next to each other, that can work to engage a whole group who then go at it. Or if you have groups that you know are going to come in a reliable way, like a large school program coming through your local historic house that you're manning as a volunteer, then you can structure that in a way that engages the whole group, rather than just me doing flint and steel with a core people of 5 that can only see it, into more of, oh, military service is a lot like camping. You've gone camping, what would you bring? That's effective. Or, 1 volunteer, 2 volunteers. Let's bring you up, throw some of our loner kit on you, talk about, what you're dressing and why. Or compare and contrast 2 different outfits with 2 of the most energetic kids in the class that would otherwise be really problematic for you and distracting if you're just trying to tell people things. Or if you have sort of a structured show and tell, I'd often just do a school group, find something that engages you, bring it up, and let's talk about it in front of everybody so that everybody's engaged. This is where we get really spicy. You guys ready?
Yes.
I think that public history demos and work, even the best museums, have to be brought up to academic code in a lot of ways. All right. So I'll give some examples. Like the lowest hanging fruit involving the least effort on your side, which can be really effective, is to have sort of a kit display. And often this is very heavy on weapons and blades, and it's all laid out on a folding table or even a blanket. Blanket's a little bit better, just visually. And that works. If you want to move up to sort of pop history, you've got your musket shoot every hour on the hour, where you sort of entertain and mislead the audience with some bull facts, things that sound really good as a compelling story. Those vicious bayonet wounds, but it's not based on documentation. It's more infotainment. I think that you can move that up to military history, where you have a semi-interactive talking about not only the weapon and the soldier, but also the training, the tactics, and how, importantly, it's not generic, how that affected the battle that you are depicting or the physical site that you're working at. It's not a generic revolutionary pageant. You all with me? People haven't thrown stuff yet, so I'm really excited about that. But what about, and I'm just putting this out there, you had a military service demo rather than a musket demo, and you contrasted the experience of a female follower with a soldier in arms, and the work that they're doing, and you had the audience decide whether washing linens and preventing disease is better than shouldering a musket and pushing an enemy off the field and affecting the political outcome of that campaign. I'm not saying I have the answer here, but I think that could be a really compelling show, because if you have a musket demo that has statistically probably a 50% female audience, but you're not talking about the experience of women in the period in the military or as adjuncts to it, you are failing, I would argue.
Losing 50% of your audience.
Yeah. You need to speak to their lived experience in as best way you can, and you need to stress the importance of laundry, among other things.
I've done something similar. I contrasted a high-class woman and a low-class woman.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we did it explicitly showing here's the dress you've got on, here's the dress, the same things, and what makes it look so different, and why. For that though, you have to have people that are going to adapt to part.
Yeah.
And I had a gal who could get out there, and she looked on everybody like they were insects.
Yeah.
Okay? And she just was very, very consistent about that. If you don't have someone who can do that, If you just have a model who sits there and goes,
Yeah.
it don't work.
So it requires people that are comfortable and have been coached to a certain degree or just have experience.
Yeah.
Or
Or just someone who is naturally good at being first person.
yeah,
That-
but one of the things that Tilden talks about, and it doesn't even have to be in first person. I'm terrible at first person. I get really awkward. Interpretation is an art that is at any basic level teachable. You can have the best buttonholes, but suck at talking to people, or just be totally disinterested. You just need to be honest about what you're there for. If your mission statement of your unit purports to educate, and that's the basis of what you do, then you need to engage the public. If you want to go have a private tactical in the woods, that's fine. Just be honest about that, whether it's online or in person, and how you approach the site, and just be upfront. Yeah. I think that you could go further with demos, for instance, and have an entire gender musket demo that focused on, you know, what does it mean to dress up like a man as a woman in the period and serve in arms? What is the non-male gendered service of women also impact the Army? If you had an environmental history demo, and you talked about, say, the history of Fort Ticonderoga as seen through the eyes of beavers. Like, that's exaggerated, but you could tell that battle's story through the history of the landscape and the way that it impacted it, rather than the other way around. If you had a transnational history demo, and you talked about, you know, a nuclear American story, we think, like the Boston Tea Party, but you talked about all the international objects that filter into that, the different cultural groups and nationalities that were engaged in that, Quaker merchants from Nantucket shipping Chinese tea to reach an Anglo-American port connected to empire but having an imperial crisis, with the British Army just on the shores of it about to engage, the Boston mob and the different social strata of the town all taking part in this unique event, but you told it from a wider perspective. You would tell that same story that people are bored by in a new light, I think. What if you had a demo around the Boston Massacre that examined the significance of race, for instance, where you talked about the icon of Crispus Attucks in the course of the 19th century abolitionist movement, and contrasted that with the fact that the 29th drummers, the soldiers who fired into that mob and killed 5 people, all the drummers in that unit were enslaved Afro-Caribbeans. And you contrasted those two explicitly, and you didn't depict the event itself and people being murdered, because you can't go all the way with that, but you talked about how race affected that pivotal American moment. What about a march rather than a pageant battle? Because you ultimately can't shoot people, and maybe you shouldn't. And I am still bewildered that people will bring their kids to see people be fake shot. I find that really jarring. Again, just playing devil's advocate, putting that out there. Particularly since statistically more men died on, say, the prison ships of the Jersey or of disease than were actually murdered in combat. I find it really jarring that you could hand a demo round, even really accurately made, of canister. Lamb's artillery, yeah? You have a tin case with musket balls nailed into a wooden block, the sabot, and you're handing that to a 10-year-old kid and wondering if people, you know, in 2050 are going to be handing out fake cluster bombs. Like, that is jarring when you're doing that for the 50th time and then suddenly you realize that. And again, just playing devil's advocacy here. Or if you didn't mention that, you know, a 10-year-old is in some respects, especially tweens, an age where they could have served in the Royal Navy, and they'd be handling that round, bringing it to a cannon to be fired, but you don't bring up that impasse because it might make their parents uncomfortable. Again, you can be provocative without being sensational, I hope. I think that there certainly is a lot of room to expand into site-specific, chronologically focused civilian events. Because statistically, the most accurate way you could depict the 18th century, and I mean those 100 years, is to eat, sleep, and farm. And there are far more non-combatants that are caught up in the storm of war of the Battle of April 19th who are fleeing the violence than are actually engaged in it. If you want to go for military pageantry, that's fine. Just be honest about that. And if you want to show statistically the most common, be honest about that. None of them are wrong, but it's a credit to the work of, say, Alfam, organization that clusters around agricultural sites and living history museums, and they should receive just as much engagement from our members as famous battlefields, I would argue. I'm really relieved nobody's thrown anything. Finally, the last 2 points that I'll close with is that in the face of modern politics, which inevitably comes up at historical events, particularly where you're trying to provoke these real discussions, and people have come with that one issue that they watched on TV and they're really bothered by, the way that I best respond to this, and you can talk about what works for you, is to go very specific and to go very old-timey. You want to get deeply into the past, move past the issue today. So for instance, I found myself on the train from Alewife Station into Boston. I was going to the Boston Tea Party. I was dressed as a sailor, like I am today, and I was going to be depicting one of the Mohawks that destroyed the tea in 1773. I found myself engaged by this lovely guy, and then he told me, oh, I'm also going to the Boston Tea Party. I'm actually going to picket it, because I'm a part of the 9/11 truther moment. I was like, oh, wow. And I'm now sitting next to a guy who's particularly lovely. He's very outgoing for me. But I have a 30-minute ride where it's uncomfortable for me to just get up and disengage. Put aside what you feel about that movement. I need to somehow, because I've put the history out there, hit him on a historical point and put aside modern 21st century politics. So I started talking about the Quebec Act. I started talking about the fact that the same bill that closed down the port in the wake of the Boston Tea Party was dramatically exaggerated or misunderstood or feared, rightfully, by Americans throughout the province. And the fact that you could end up with sort of hysteria over the British establishing a bishopric for French-Canadian Catholics in Quebec. And it was all because of the actions of this one conspiratorial minister, the Earl of Bute. Have you heard of him? And we ended that conversation based on period fears and agitation and political unrest. It was kind of weird. He was like, yeah, I gotta look that up. That sounds legit. But in a sense, like, it's not about winning the conversation. It's about, like, you're really concerned about government overreach. I don't know if I agree with you, and I don't know if our perception of reality is the same, but I can hit you with a pretty similar reaction in the 18th century. I had a visitor that came in really, really animated about the Mexicans to my clothing workshop while I was discussing, textiles with a family. And it's not something that I could approach in modern terms. So we got into a discussion of the history of American nativism and the way that engaged political parties. And I made it pretty clear through my discussion of that by the time we got to the 1840s and the know-nothings, the guy stormed out because I wasn't hitting directly at what he wanted to talk about. I was skirting the issue and diving deep into the past and addressing the Saratoga Monument to Benedict Arnold's leg rather than the guy who wanted to engage me on people taking down statues, regardless of how you feel about that. That's my approach. I'd love to hear what works for you. The final point, and I don't want to be too heavy, is that interpretive sites, museums, historical organizations, and the volunteers who work for them need to defend human dignity. That there is a line in the sand where someone is blatantly disrespectful, offensive, particularly in front of other people, or just genuinely comes at you. And that is a line where you need to feel confident that the site backs you up, your boss or your NCO. You're not going to start throwing punches. You're not going to melt down because that's not going to be productive. But you need to feel confident that you can respond in a way that respects your dignity or the visitor that person may be attacking, I would argue.
Big span in
Again, not assault charges, but I think that there is a line there. One of the things that really broke my public history career in a lot of ways, because I wanted to continue in museums, was giving a tour which ended up a one-on-one interaction with a neo-Nazi who was defending the institution of slavery as the backbone of every advanced Western civilization, and was talking about how I should check out the works of Goebbels and Himmler and Hitler. And I was alone on a mountaintop with this man, and I had no confidence that if I just simply told him to leave, the site would back me up. And you need to have those conversations in advance. You need to know that your well-being or that visitor's perception of the site and perception of your organization is not going to allow customer service to get in the way of people's self-worth or your own self-worth. That was a really heavy note to lead on. But that's all I got. What's up? Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you because everything you're saying is brilliant. And for the most part, I realized just in the past few months that a lot of us learn